Hello, everybody, and welcome to what we've just determined is the middle of the 10th year of Inside Out, which is a tribute to either our lack of imagination or our success in putting on programs that people like. My name's Dan Fagan. I'm the director of the SHERP program, Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting program here at the Carter Institute of Journalism, which is a mouthful. Here at NYU, and it's a real pleasure to have my friend Laura Helmuth here. And Lee will introduce her, but Laura is an amazingly awesome person and a real leader in our field in some important ways. But Lee gets the pleasure of extolling her virtues, so I'll turn it over to the birthday boy who just celebrated his birthday 2 days ago. He's 42 years old. Lee Holtz. Like Salman Rushdie, he has the august title of Distinguished Writer in Residence here at the Carter Institute of Journalism. So, Professor Holtz, it's all yours.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. So welcome to Inside Out. And for those of you who have not joined us before, in addition to food and drink, we suspend the news cycle for an evening's conversation about the best of our craft and profession as practiced by the best among us. Old media, new media, social media, digital media, disruptive media. Amid so much technological change, one thing stays constant. Good writers, reporters, need great editors. Now, we talk a lot about writing, but less so about the elements of editing. The formula is full of a lot of subtle variables that are hard to articulate, harder still perhaps to explain. Ideally, editors are the enablers of good science journalism. Practically, though, they often are faceless, largely anonymous gatekeepers. So this evening, let's put a face on editing. Laura Helmuth, an editor specializing in science, health, and the environment. She's been a writer and editor for Science magazine and the science editor for many years for Smithsonian magazine, and is now the science and health editor for Slate magazine. As she's also, you may like to know, the vice president of the National Association of Science Writers. Now, former Wired editor Chris Anderson, who trained as a physicist, has a name for his favorite type of writers, the failed scientists. Now, if this category extends to editors, Laura is certainly an example. Sure. She's the first in her family to attend college. She studied biology and psychology at Eckerd College. She has a PhD, though, in cognitive neuroscience from UC Berkeley, and did her dissertation on pattern learning among Parkinson's patients. Though I think more relevant to her work as an editor constantly on deadline, she also published research that encompassed the neural mechanisms of timing. She's an opinionator, and in that regard, as an editor at Slate, she breaks the rule that editors should be seen but not heard. She writes fiercely argumentative essays. She slams James Watson, sticks up for the red cockaded woodpecker, lauds the hugger-in-chief, knocks Jonathan Franzen as the world's most annoying birdwatcher, and recently gave Robert F. Kennedy Jr. a swift kick in the editorial butt as being obsessive and dangerous about a discredited connection between autism and vaccinations. She's an advocate for freelancers, you'll all be glad to know, push for better representation of women and minorities in the science writing community, and has, for much of her career, conducted a one-woman campaign to demystify and improve the relationship between writers and editors, which is the subject of our conversation this evening. I want to emphasize that this is a conversation, not a lecture. I encourage you to interrupt as the spirit moves, encourage us to digress in interesting and creative ways. So let's begin, Laura, with a kind of broader essay question. So, as an editor, and we'll talk in a minute about how you got there, but as an editor, how would you sort of describe your basic approach to science writing?
Yeah, that's a good question. It depends a little bit on who I'm editing for. Right now at Slate, my approach is very writer-centric. I definitely want people to write about their passions, write in their own voice, write their own opinions. So it's a little more writer-oriented than I've been at some other publications that have a slightly more strict formula about what counts as a story for science or what counts as a story for Smithsonian, which is a real pleasure. I mean, this is the best kind of editing you can do, is basically telling people to write what gets them really excited. So that's what I'm doing now. In general, though, like the biggest things I care about in editing are clarity at all times, and not just clarity for the reader's sake, but also clarity for the writer's sake. And I think this is something that some editors could do a lot better, is explain to the writer why they're making the edits they're making. And I put a lot of time into explaining to the writer what we're looking for, why this metaphor is a little bit incongruous, what could be better. And I think that's something that when people ask, what do you need, what should editors do better, that's the main thing, I think.
Well, let me dial that back just for a second. So you said, well, at Slate, I'm writer-centric. But that's because of the audience that you're writing for. So tell us a little bit about who you think your audience is, or who you know your audience is.
Oh yeah, that's a good question. It's a real pleasure and a privilege, and it's really easy in a way to edit for Slate and to write for it when I write, which is not very often, because it's a magazine that I always read, like from the very beginning, from 1996. And fortunately, a lot of people who write for us have been reading us. So that makes it easier. They have a sense of the tone, of the what sort of arguments you can make, what sort of areas of interest the readers have. But otherwise, traditionally, our classic understanding of who reads Slate is people who are goofing off at work. And we look at a lot of metrics, and you can look day by day.
That's when I read Slate mostly.
Yeah, exactly. I always have. And so we can tell, we see a daily rhythm. So 8 or 9 o'clock on the East Coast, it starts to go up, and it goes down around 5 or 6. And Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then Saturday, Sunday it goes down. Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Yeah, so basically during the week and during office hours, people read the bejesus out of Slate, and that's where they come from.
Well, there's some research that's just come out in the last couple of days. It's looking at the proposition that the more distracted you are, the more creative that you're being.
Yeah.
So you're really enabling a lot of...
We're responsible for American productivity.
That's what I was going to say, yeah. So given that you not only have this strong sense that you have a very loyal readership, and you have probably a bucket full of demographics about who they are or whatever, you also have this kind of time rhythm.
Yeah.
Does that shape how you pick subject matter for this? I mean, is it like it's 10 o'clock, it's time to get snarky? I mean, what?
It does a little bit. I think our social media team pays more attention to that. So like does everybody do Twitter at night? Like night Twitter is really interesting, much more interesting than daytime Twitter in a lot of ways, and weekend Twitter. So they will tweet out certain stories with certain Twitter lines more in the evening and in the weekends. But as far as, we pay a lot of attention to timing for when we schedule stories to go live.
Right.
And we know there are certain sweet spots where you can sort of, get a boost of attention. And if you publish on a Friday afternoon, and I learned this the hard way, no matter how good the story is, it's just going to fizzle. So that's mostly what we pay attention to, is when to schedule stories.
So do you think that's unique to Slate and its readership, or do you think that's a broader characteristic of just readers in the 21st century who are getting their things on free feeds?
Yeah, I think people who are reading online, that's definitely the case. And it's something everybody should sort of keep in mind, both for your personal Twitter feeds and Facebook feeds, and if you're at a place where you have any control over when your stories are published or when you can publish them yourselves. I think a lot of magazines have the same pattern, which is that weekends are sort of dead times. There's a little bit of a difference. In the summer, they're really dead times. In the winter, when it's a blizzard and nobody's got anything else to do other than sit at home and read their stupid computer because they can't go outside, it's a little bit less extreme. But it's definitely something to keep in mind when you're thinking about when you've got a real big story and you want it to jump. Make sure that there are people there who will notice it.
Okay. So, but this is, I have to say, all sounds very advanced, very jumped up, very jazzy. You have a big sort of computerized display with like 50 different dials and things telling you like who's reading what and where they are reading it from and what their income is. This is all very impressive and sophisticated, but I know that you're a small town person, that you began in a small town, and I'm wondering if you would tell us a little bit about that arc, how you got from being a steady reader of the Quayle family's Indianapolis Star to something as kind of jumped up and hip as Slate. They don't really seem...
No, yeah, this is the first hip thing I've done in my whole life.
Yeah?
Yeah,
Okay, okay.
Which is, it's a pleasure to do hip things. But yeah, I grew up in Indianapolis reading the Indianapolis Star, which at that time was owned by Dan Quayle's family. And the Indianapolis Star is the reason Dan Quayle made it to the Senate, the reason he was the embarrassing vice president of the United States for 4 years. So blame the Indianapolis Star for all the bad things that happened in the 80s. But anyhow, it was a terrible newspaper. It was very ridiculously xenophobic, jingoistic, hyper-conservative, and they covered Dan Quayle on the front page basically every other day. It was a terrible, terrible magazine. And then I went to college in Florida at Eckerd College, and I started reading the St. Pete Times, which is now the Tampa Bay Times, which is a wonderful newspaper. And it was really eye-opening that there was such a range of journalism at that time. And I've been reading the newspaper sort of obsessively since I was a kid, which did everybody else do that? Did you all grow up reading the news, or, you know, not necessarily like the paper, stain your fingers newspaper, but you grew up reading stuff, right? So that's basically the best thing you can do to prepare for a career in journalism is to read a lot of journalism, you know, as much as you can, as early as you can, to sort of get a feel for everything.
Right, but I have to interrupt you. You're a disgruntled reader.
Yes.
You don't like the Indianapolis Star.
Oh, terrible.
You hate it, in
Yes.
fact, or something. You know,
Yeah.
you're, and then when you are at Eckerd in Florida, I mean, it's true you're in the circulation area of what then was the St. Petersburg Time, and as you say, is now the Tampa Bay paper. But you're not like out there, you know, flogging stories to the St. Pete Times or trying to be a stringer for Time Magazine. I mean, you're chasing psychology and the life sciences.
Yeah,
so
I was in the lab. I was doing
pre-med, right?
Pre-med. Oh, yeah, bad major. So yeah, I was taking. I mean, the science classes were great. It's just when you take a lot of pre-med classes, you have a lot of classes with pre-med majors who are horrible people. So.
But
So
not
that
you.
part is-
But not
no,
you, right?
yes,
Yeah.
everybody else.
You're the nice one.
Right, yeah, the exception. So yeah, I just read the news. I just enjoyed it and kind of developed a sense early on of what's good and what's bad. And that's something that's really important as an editor too. I feel like I've learned good editing from good editors, but I've also learned good editing from bad editors. Because when you see something that's just wrong, that's informative in its own way. And so reading bad journalism, you know, which in retrospect I realized a bit at the time, but even more afterwards that it was bad. That was a good lesson that didn't pay off for another 10 years or so.
So without really knowing it, you were taking a long, slow seminar in the journalism that repelled you.
Right,
Okay,
exactly, yeah.
Okay. But you know, you're pursuing science as a full-time thing. So yes, no, pre-med, maybe not. But you go to Berkeley in graduate school. You're cognitive neuroscience. It is classic, and that, of course, many science writers of a certain generation get halfway through their PhD, discover they don't really like lab work quite as much as they thought. It's wet, it's messy, it's boring,
It takes forever.
Although they love science, they take a quick detour, and the next thing you know, they're writing science articles for whomever. But you actually, you know, were some successes as a scientist. You're there, you finished your PhD, finished your dissertation, you're off publishing.
Yeah.
What went wrong, Laura?
I know. Yeah. It's, well, it all started one summer when I took a job for a travel guide. There used to be a travel guide series called the Berkeley Guides, which was they were competitors to Let's Go. So instead of written by Harvard students, they were written by Berkeley students. So they were kind of grungier, cheaper. You know, the places they covered were grungier and cheaper, a little looser in their morals. Anyhow, so I spent a summer writing for this travel guide, and I realized, oh my gosh, this is even more fun than science. It's a blast, and it comes fairly easily. And so when I got back after the summer,
Where'd you go? You went?
Oh, I covered the Czech Republic and Slovakia.
Okay.
It was shortly after the Velvet divorce. So the people in Slovakia were still all riled up, and they hated the people in Czech Republic, and the people in Czech Republic were like, yeah, whatever, if they wanted to go, that's fine. It was an odd time to be in Eastern Europe. And then when I got back, I was still a grad student. I was finishing my dissertation, but I could take whatever classes I wanted to. And is that the case at NYU? If you're a student, can you take any class you want to, or do you have to just take them in your department? Do you know? Depends. Okay. Yeah, but if you can, I mean, I know you're very busy, but one of the great things about being in grad school is being able to at least sit in on classes in other departments if there's something that interests you. And so I started sitting in on classes in the journalism school. And yeah.
They're already sitting in classes in the journalism
yes,
school.
right.
So.
So, but you could sit in on classes in the science department if you wanted to. Yeah. So anyhow,
all right,
that,
but
that
okay. So
easier.
you've made a start at guidebooks,
Yeah.
but I'm still not clear on the great leap forward here.
Oh yeah, yeah. So I sat in on some of these classes. One of them was a class in health reporting. It was just one class. This was at Berkeley. They mostly focused on political and cultural journalism. But anyhow, I asked this poor adjunct professor if I could sit in on his class in health reporting, and he said, yeah, sure, I guess. And so the first day, he hands out papers from a NEJM study, and he says, okay, everybody, you've got 5 minutes, read the story, and write a lead. And
This is the New England Journal of Medicine.
This is New England Journal of Medicine, yeah. And so, you know, everybody starts looking at the story and madly writing, and I had to say, what's a lead?
Right.
He was very nice about it and didn't just roll his eyes and make me go away, but
Yeah,
explained what a lead was.
the sixth of the 5 W's, right?
Yes.
Who, what, where, why, and what's a lead.
What's a, there you go. Asking the big questions, yeah, yeah. So anyhow, that class, it was a great class. I really enjoyed it, did pretty well. And anyhow, he recommended that I go to the UC Santa Cruz science writing program. So I did that, which at the time was, NYU's department. Did SHRP exist back in like 97?
Oh,
It did, okay.
SHRP is the foundation stone of modern journalism.
But Santa Cruz was right down the road. Otherwise, I'm sure I would have come here.
Santa Cruz, excellent program, yes. Although you do have to go through the rest of your life as a slug,
That's okay.
which is their mascot.
Yeah.
So,
Which if you have to have a mascot, it could be like the Redskins or something truly awful. But
It's true.
It's like
It's true.
making fun of mascots.
But I don't want to get dazzled by talk of slugs and mascots and things. I want to pin you down. So you turned your back on a career as a researcher. That's an interesting move. Probably horrified your parents.
They were still mad that I hadn't gone to med school.
There's okay. Well, maybe the penumbra of that anger
Yeah.
masked the second move. You were already doomed.
Yeah.
But I want to know, like, what was the spark? What was the fuse here? Because it doesn't seem obvious to me.
Yeah. Well, I really enjoyed doing science, but I just liked writing more. And I had this vague idea that I was going to be a freelance writer and live in Montana and have a really glamorous life. None of that came true at all.
Michelle Nijos, who actually
But
does
she
this,
actually
is
did
coming
this,
next
yes.
time. Yeah.
She can tell
later
you
this spring.
the true
Later this
dream.
spring.
Yeah.
So you did a lot of internships.
Yes.
You did
Did a lot of internships.
4 internships? 3 internships?
A couple during the program and then 3 full ones afterwards.
So tell us about internships and what they did for you.
Yeah.
Where did you go?
Well, the first one was the a Department of Energy Idaho National Lab internship. And that was kind of a weird one.
I
Because
thought you did a small paper first.
Oh, I did. During the program, I did the Salinas Californian.
The Salinas Californian.
Yes. And it was an El Nino year. And I tell you what, there's no better training for a SHRP type writer than an El Nino year in California.
And
in
why
an
is that?
agricultural area. There were mudslides, there were roads being washed out, the artichoke crop was in trouble. It was chaos. And most of the reporters there, it was a place where you'd start your career. And most of the reporters there didn't know how to read a Gulf Stream or a jet stream. So I did a lot of basic weather reporting and geology and animals and stuff like that. So
Okay, well, actually, useful experience.
yeah.
Okay, and then the Department of Energy.
Then I did the Department of Energy, yeah. And then I went to Science News, which if you all are looking for a really good internship, it's an excellent one. It's 3 months. They basically throw you in and you're just like another staff writer. You get lots of clips, lots of cover stories. So that's a good one. And then I did Science Magazine's news department, which is different from Science News. So Science News is its own magazine, and then there's Science, which has a news department. And then I did an internship there, and then I got hired.
So why so many internships?
Well, I think, don't you still have to do a lot of, there were no jobs.
Okay. Okay. Well, that is one theory of internships,
Yeah.
which is it is the old foot in the door.
Yeah.
And it does often work that way. But I'm just, curious about whether that actually worked for you. I mean, I know
It
that
did,
you
yeah, it
eventually,
worked for me, yeah.
well, the fourth time.
No, that was the third.
Third?
Well, the first one was just a part-time
Oh, I
internship
see,
during the
I see,
program.
okay,
And then
okay.
the DOE was,
Uh-huh.
they paid for my Santa
Uh-huh.
Cruz thing, so it was a little complicated.
So you had a lot of practice as an
A lot of
intern.
practice. Yes.
So
yes.
what makes for the perfect journalist intern?
Yeah, that's very good to know. The thing to always do as an intern is to say yes. Whatever the request is, your answer is yes, I will do that thing. And basically make yourself as indispensable as possible. And in my case, I was at Science's news department shortly after they'd launched Science Now. Did everybody read Science Now, or have you written for it, anybody?
Science Now
is Science Magazine's news department's online news service, which at that time was publishing 5 or 6 news stories every day. And it was the first daily science news site. That was, a huge deal. They started it in '96, I think. Nobody else was doing it.
Right.
It was in front of the firewall, so the audience was growing.
And because it was the internet, and because
Yes.
it was pioneering, and because it was exciting, no one in the print staff wanted to write for it.
Correct. Yes.
So they turned to the intern.
Yeah, they're like,
Because
because I say yes. Yeah.
you say yes. So what happened?
Yeah. So basically, that was the problem, is that nobody on staff wanted to write for the online site because they thought nobody would read it, and it wasn't as prestigious as actually having your thing in print that would come out in a physical paper property, and it would have pictures, and it would look great, and and also, frankly, to their credit, they were paid by the column inch. Freelancers were, and the staff reporters had to fill up a certain number of pages each year. That was sort of their deal. That's how their productivity was measured. And so there wasn't a good way to say, well, if I do the Science Now story, it counts as an equivalent of however much in print. So there was nothing in it for them except more work. So nobody wanted to edit it, so I said, I'll edit it. I'd love to edit. And also I got to work with a lot of freelancers because they would work for cheap and weren't too proud to write for online. So I got a lot of experience editing stories in a lot of different fields of science, and working with a lot of different kinds of writers very quickly.
So if I'm listening to this properly, you volunteer for your first editing gig, fired mostly by enthusiasm, but you actually don't know anything about editing. Or have you somehow
Yes.
acquired editing experience
That's right.
that you neglected to tell us about in this?
Editing
in
is
this
mostly faking it. Yeah, acting
Editing
like
is
it.
mostly faking it. Many of us have suspected this.
Yeah, it's all true. You're not wrong. Yeah, I'd done editing. I'm sure as SHRP students do, you edit each other's papers, right? You all edit each other's stories, and I realized in the program that I was pretty good at that, and the professors who were teaching the classes said I was good at that. So I kind of enjoyed it too. I liked that part of the process, but I had no formal editing training. And do you guys have an editing class in the program? Or?
Class.
Yeah. Okay, so you do. It's just not formal, Okay. So yeah, that's pretty much all the experience I'd had. And then when I started, you just sort of learn by trial and error as an editor. And like I say, you learn from the good editors and you learn from the bad editors how not to be a bad editor.
I think this is really interesting, but when you just sort of said that, I had a kind of chill go down my spine. Because when you said, oh, you learn by trial and error, and I
Yeah.
suddenly realized, wow, we're the raw material of your learning
Yeah,
process.
exactly.
you know?
That's right. You put it in the oven, and now 40 minutes wasn't long enough. That looks terrible. Yeah.
So there you are at Science Now, like merrily orchestrating coverage of this new enterprise. What was the biggest mistake you made as
that's a
a
good question.
newbie?
Yeah. I mean, I think.
Given that your learning curve is trial and error.
Yes, yeah. I didn't make any errors that involved the lawyers, so nothing that
That's a good
cost
start.
us any money, nothing that made anybody too irate. I misspelled somebody's name, not at Science, but when I wrote a freelance article for the Monterey Bay newspaper about a bird watching Christmas count. And that's haunted me to this day. I'm sure everybody's got a misspelling story that they just wake up in chills still. But
We only had just one.
yeah, well, that's true. Maybe they get easier. It's just the first one that haunts you. But I think, I wasn't very self-confident, and that's something, we talked about this a little bit before, where some of the students here do a video kind of pre-questionnaire with the speakers for Inside Out. And yeah, I was terrified all the time. And I realized I should have asked more questions, been more aggressive about certain things. And I was definitely a chicken about reporting. I was just really nervous about reporting, like calling people up.
So am I wrong to then assume part of what attracted you to editing was the ability to avoid dealing with the
Yes,
public?
that's right,
So,
yes.
Okay.
That's right, it's true, yeah. I mean,
No,
and some
yeah.
people thrive on that. They want to just, dig in and call everybody and get all the gossip, and which I enjoy, but it was, I found that pretty stressful.
Okay, so you were at Science Now, and that actually turned into a full-time job, which is ideally what internships are supposed to do, and often do. It's like you get before the 90-day warranty gives out, you have a
That's right.
chance
They
to
kicked all my tires.
kick the tires. Yeah. So Science to Smithsonian to Slate, two mostly print publications, and a solely digital enterprise. I'm wondering, from your standpoint, what the difference between editing for a print publication, like say Smithsonian, is and editing for a digital publication.
Yeah, I mean, it's your sense of time is completely different. It's kind of like going from academia to journalism, where normally you have to write your grant every couple of years, and that seems to come along just every minute. But it's definitely the case going from a weekly and a monthly to basically a minutely or an hourly, like Slate is. Just the speed at which you process things is much faster. However, when I was at Science Now, that was very fast too. That was 5 or 6 stories every single day. So from the beginning, I liked doing things quickly. And Smithsonian felt very sluggish in that way. So when I was at Smithsonian, I ended up doing a lot of kind of pro bono editing and writing for the website, just because there was so much that you couldn't fit into a magazine. I mean, once you're out of the print world, you realize how constricting it is to have 5 pages, and that's all. So the wonderful thing about online is you can run as many stories as you
Right.
can. So that's
No,
the best part.
it's 2015, and we have finally understood
yes,
that.
Right, yes.
But what I'm curious about is the frame is different. So
Yeah.
Smithsonian, to use them as an example, has a website, and they have blogs of the years, and they have a Twitter feed for everything, and they no doubt think they're just right up to the minute.
Yes.
And Slate, of course, thinks the same thing, perhaps with better reason. But the editorial frames are different, and I don't think I'm wrong in thinking that Smithsonian's frame is of a print journal, no matter what they're doing online.
That's right, yeah.
That's a legacy mindset. But also, it's a different enterprise. So that's what I was curious about. Maybe a better way to ask the question is this way. So how would it be different if I were pitching you for Smithsonian
Yes.
versus pitching you for Slate?
Yeah, the thing with Smithsonian, what Slate has is a lot more opinion. What Smithsonian has is a lot more respectful of the science, of the characters, of everybody involved, of the status quo of the world. And Slate is a lot, edgier, argumentative, mouthy. So the sort of tones are completely different, and then also the timescales are different. So at Slate, or pretty much anywhere these days, you want to write about something that's in the news right now, that stupid blue dress that everybody's talking about an hour ago, we're going to write something about it. Versus with Smithsonian, the formula for a Smithsonian natural history story would start out, you would be, well, first of all, we pay people expenses to go travel and report stories in depth in some other place. But often what would happen is the story would start out with the character, the main character, who's usually some sort of biologist, in a Range Rover at dawn looking for the eye shine of the jaguar. It always started with the weather and what it looked like and the animals, which is great. I mean, it's a good formula. It's a formula because it works. But then, 2 or 3 graphs down, 5 graphs down, you would have a paragraph that would start, in the past decade, scientists have discovered, and then there's your net graph, and that's the time scale you're looking at, is the accretion of about 10 years worth of research, and that's when it's time to write about something for a print publication, especially a monthly, that doesn't specialize in science, because you basically want to say everything there is to say about this research, because you won't get to it again for maybe another 10 years. Versus basically any other publication in the world, you can write about something that happened yesterday that is still a mystery, that with the idea that you'll come back to it as the research fills out. And part of that is specialization. So like at Science, you would cover every stage of a research project. But at Slate, because our readers don't necessarily come for the science coverage, they come for politics or culture, so they don't want to know every single step, but they want to have something that's timely, but that has a little bit of a bow on the end, that's still in progress, but it's not like every single step. You still have to have some sort of conclusion to make it worth telling non-experts about.
So timely, we've had distinguished magazine writers in here talking about pitching, people like you at Smithsonian, say, and they'll give sage advice about, oh well, I spent 3 months researching that pitch.
Yeah.
If I want to be the Slate writer who is doing the story on Thursday about the color vision problem with the dress that went viral on, what did I say, Thursday, so Wednesday afternoon. I mean, how do I pitch that to you? How do I insert myself into that rapid fire cycle?
Yeah, well, you have to, it's tricky. You basically have to always be on the lookout for something that you know something about, especially for the breaking news. Is Pascal here? I can't see very well. Oh, yeah. So here's the guy. So we had like a...
Right. That's why I was thinking of this in
He's
particular.
He's actually an expert on the subject.
Right.
And so when the blue dress craziness erupted, he, through another writer who's written for me, sent me a message like that night or the next day, basically.
Yes, but wait for the microphone, please, which Professor Fagan has there.
Hello? Oh, so I'm a little hoarse because I've been...
Introduce yourself.
My name is Pascal Wallisch. I'm a clinical assistant professor in the Department of Psychology, and I'm a little hoarse because I've been talking about the dress for 2 weeks now. But we still need to address it. So Lauren's exactly right. So I've been doing research on this for 15 years, okay? So I was ready. When the dress broke, this was my moment. So I sat down. I didn't even pitch it or anything like that. I just wrote it. And then a friend of mine brought it to the attention of Lauren, and she looked at it in the morning, and she was minor edits, and that was it, ready to go.
Yeah,
minor edits, I feel obliged to say, because are you not a product of Stephen Hall's?
I was actually just going to mention. I mean, it is without hyperbole to say that he literally taught me how to write for a general audience. So I 5 years ago I took your workshop, right? And I had a very jargon-laden life, okay? And he basically told me up front, like, you cannot write like this. You can't do it. It's impossible, okay? And I wasn't even aware of my own bubble because I had always done very well for myself writing for an academic audience. Mm-hmm. But so I was not aware of my own bubble that I was living in. But he just told me up front, yeah, you can't do any of this. So most of what I thought was elegant writing, he basically said it's throat clearing. And he just cut it, he edited it out or told me you can't do that. So anyway, so what I'm saying is that, basically what you said, like you have to, how do I put this? I've been doing this for 10, 15 years. No one ever cared. There's a cultural equivalent of attention. There's this spotlight of attention that's moving very rapidly, like 1 or 2 days. There was 9.5 million tweets about the dress in 2 days.
9.5 million?
Million, yes.
Yeah. I recall seeing one. I don't think it was Slate. It might have been BuzzFeed. But it was like 23 million
views. That was views.
23 million views.
But tweets, that's incredible. And as a matter of fact, I was teaching on Monday and asked my students, who of my students had seen the dress. 125 out of 125, everyone had seen it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and anyway, I don't want to, hijack this discussion, but I've never seen anything like it. So, but basically, you have to strike the iron while it's hot. Usually, I would say, there should be no science news. You should write about what's the past because it's still going to be new to non-experts, and the new science is always wrong.
Yeah. So, but see, here's the thing, and we're going to take the microphone away from you, not because it's not interesting, but because I want to bring it back here. So that works for you, who've already spent 15 years studying this thing, that you have driven people out of rooms at cocktail parties, trying to explain because it's fascinating. But now, that's a different kind of opportunity for someone in your shoes than it is for someone perhaps in those of us who are coming to it for the news, not because we're already
Yeah.
got with science. And I'm wondering, so, he kind of glossed over this, oh, well, a friend brought it to your attention. You owe your friend a drink.
And I do too, yeah.
But how did that work from your standpoint? So, I mean, seriously, this happens so fast.
Yeah, it happened.
How do you, as an assignment editor or, the science and health editor at Slate, A, decide you want to jump on this?
Yeah.
2, decide it's not moving so fast that if you try to jump on it, it'll be gone by the time you get your saddle. And 3, how do you assign somebody?
Yeah, it's tricky. So when there is a big story, they're usually 1, 2, or 3 waves. So the initial wave is almost always done by staff writers. So if you're a freelancer, it's really hard to cover a breaking news story and to be the first reporter on it. If it's huge, the editor is going to call in somebody on staff. And in this case, we have dedicated breaking news reporters. So they talk to me. We always have someone on staff, even in the middle of the night, and this is the guy who did it.
Okay.
During the day, we have 1 or 2. And so they often send their stories to me if there's any kind of science. So I edited that. And if I didn't get any pitches on it that night, if I had, I might have assigned something, but it didn't happen to happen. So, and most people won't. So the real sweet spot, if you're a freelancer, is to have a different take. Not just this happened, but this is why it happened. This is what's interesting. This is why everybody else is wrong about it. Those sorts of stories do really well, especially this is why everybody else is wrong. Anything that can make the reader feel smarter than the rest of the world, that's the sort of like angle you want to be looking for. And then there's another story to be done a week later saying, oh wow, what was that craziness about? Here's what we can pull from it. And so basically, anytime past breaking, what you want to do is distinguish yourself from everybody else who's been following the news and can do a straight explanatory story and explain it instead, have a different take on it, have something unusual, something that not everybody else has said. So right before the dress, the big story that everybody saw was the llamas. Did anybody see the llama? Yeah. So,
I barely had time to see the llamas
Yeah.
before I got hit by the dress.
What a week. Yeah. So I got a pitch right after the last llama had been captured by somebody who'd pitched me before, and unfortunately we hadn't found anything that quite worked. And her subject line was, you want my story about artificial llama vaginas. And I said, well, tell me more about your artifact. I think I do. And she'd been working on a story sort of off and on for years about breeding exotic species and how it's really difficult. And there's like this whole set of science and engineering around like getting males to ejaculate, and there's like dolls involved, and it's fascinating. It's gross to some people. I thought it was great. So anyhow, I said, yes, of course I want your story on artificial llama vaginas. And in any other given week, I might not have been able to take it, although I think I would have. I like to think I would always want a story on llama vaginas, but especially
I
when
would
everybody was
too.
talking about
I'd like to
llamas.
think that's a timeless topic.
Yeah, so everybody in this room, I'm sure, has some subject that you sort of know about, that you're interested in, that isn't necessarily what you're writing your thesis on or what you've done any assignments on, but that you could toss something off really quickly if it's in the news, and just always be prepared to jump on that. So like at Slate, I don't write that very often, but I did a story about Janet Guthrie, who was the first woman to compete in the Indy 500, who was my hero when I was like 7. So, and I wrote about her, 30 years later, so 40 years later. So you never, remember what your passions are and sort of notice what you notice. And if there's something in the news that you happen to have a weird take on, pitch away, especially to me, please.
Right, and just
yeah.
to follow up on that, that is
please.
such good advice. And the really important thing is just to identify a few things that you're absolutely fascinated with that everyone else doesn't know about.
Yeah.
And just follow them. Don't let them go. Like if you put in the time to do a feature on llama vaginas, stay up on llama vaginas. It's really important. And whatever it is, because everything Laura can tell us, but for someone like Laura, she doesn't want a commodity storyteller. She wants a storyteller who actually knows something, who knows something and has a kind of a unique take on it, and that's really important. Can I ask you a different question, if that's okay, Lee?
Go ahead, yeah.
So I'm really interested in, like, when people think about Laura, they always say the same thing. They say two things. Number one, that her opinion pieces are amazing. She always as a fearless and utterly sensible yet smoking take on whatever it is, and she's always right. But the second thing they say is that Laura is like an amazing mentor. And I wanted to ask you about this idea of mentorship and what that really means, because I find, as someone who directs a graduate program, that mentorship in the professional world barely exists, if at all. And every year there's less and less of it. And so by default, it falls to professors. You know, it falls to graduate programs. It falls to your peers, your community. So how do you actually do that, and why do you do it? And realistically, can you actually do it with everyone who wants to be your mentor, your mentee?
Yeah. We're going to circle back to the editorial writing, and we'll finish with pitches, but I think that's a very good question, because, you know, one mentor-mentee relationships are all very common and encouraged and codified and formalized in the corporate world. Don't exist in journalism, and it can't be just because we're all competing for the story, although that's certainly an element. But you, as Dan suggests, have really kind of made a name for yourself. That's why we all like you, Laura. We think you're looking out for us.
Nice.
How does that happen, and how does that work?
It's purely selfish. Like, as an editor, especially if you're an editor who works with freelancers, you know, you don't get bylines, which you know is one of the reasons that a lot of people don't want to be editors. You get no credit, and your sort of career is built on relationships. And so, I mean, this isn't why I do it, not literally, but I mean, selfishly, if you want to be a good editor, you need to build up a strong network of freelancers who trust you and who you can trust, because this whole business is so built on trust. I mean, writers make stuff up, editors destroy your copy. You know, you need to find people who you can work with in a way that makes everybody better and more creative and wonderful. So there's that, and I work with a lot of freelancers and always have, and love doing that. And also, I mean, there's social justice reasons for, you know, helping people who might not have the self-confidence or the assistance to have a chance to have their voice expressed. And again, this is a selfish thing too. No offense to white males who are straight and privileged and went to prep school, but you're overrepresented in the media. And there's a certain kind of story that you know about if you are a straight white male who went to prep school and Harvard. And it's a good story. I mean, we read all those stories and they're wonderful, and some of my best friends are straight white males who went to Harvard. But if you want to find people who have something fresh to say, they aren't necessarily the people who are seeking you out and say, ooh, I want to say this for Slate. So, it really helps to talk to people who have different backgrounds, different sorts of experience, different stories to tell. So that's one of the main
But if that's
let me
in your interest, though,
go ahead.
Why doesn't everyone do that? In fact, almost no one does it. You know, and I agree. It can give you the edge in terms of finding the take that no one else has, finding the young writer who is brilliant and, you know, could be working for the New Yorker, but they haven't found him yet, or her.
Because the New Yorker is completely not open to
Right, the New Yorker is utterly closed.
Yeah.
Exactly, that's the point.
Yeah.
So, why?
Yeah, part of it, I mean, for me, what I get out of it is, like, you know, when I talk about editing being, you know, that you have to empathize, you have to see things from people's point of view, and, you know, consider the writer and things like that. Like, it makes it sound like I'm a really nice person, which I'm actually not. Like, I literally don't like dogs and children. But I really like writers. Like, I just love writers. And I find they have super interesting things to say, and sometimes they're anxious, sometimes they're bluffing, whatever. So I get a kick out of it. So it's a satisfying thing for me to do too.
That's interesting, because, I mean, as Dan was more polite, but the attitude of most editors, mainstream or digital, is of a predatory wasp looking at a caterpillar they might plant their eggs in. You know, I mean,
and make the caterpillar.
Yeah, right. It's like, let's suck it out, get the cool 15 once in a lifetime story, and then move on. And don't write, and don't let the door hit you in the ass on your way out. But I get a sense that, I appreciate your social justice concerns, and they're excellent, and it's a thing that science journalism has actually struggled with actively for many, many years, and not really done for all its good intentions, done a very good job of broadening itself. But I don't think it's just that. I mean, you're investing in people.
Yes, investing in people, and it pays off, in the end. Right now, at Slate, it's a wonderful place to write for. Everybody should please pitch to me. It doesn't pay particularly well.
Well, what's not particularly well?
It depends. For like a really simple blog post, $100. For most stories, a few $100s. If something's like deeply reported, that can go higher. But you don't do it for the money necessarily. So you do it if you have something to say that you can't say at a place that pays well. Which the places that pay well don't want you to say what you want to say. They want to say what they want to say. So that's sort of the trade-off. When it comes time to say what you want to say, then generally you're not going to be paid well for it. So you're going to want to work for people who you trust, who you know, who you've written for. And it happens all the time that somebody who heard me talk at an event like this, or who wrote for me from Science Now, 15 years ago, will come back and say, "Oh, I was really mad about something, and so I thought about you."
I'm sorry.
Which is the best thing.
I just want to linger on that
happens,
for a second. But so, okay, I thought of you. I was really mad about something. I thought about you. So let's go back then to pitches. And let me just ask you, what's the most common mistake you see in pitches that come flying past you when people are mad and they think of you?
Well, if they're mad and they think about me, usually it's a good pitch. Like very rarely is a bad pitch also an animated pitch. And this is so some of the best advice I ever got on writing opinion pieces came from a writer named Molly Ivins. Has anybody heard of her? She was a columnist in Texas. Wonderful, wonderful. If you get a chance, read a collection of her essays called Molly Ivins Can't Say That, Can She? It is very, very, very funny. Anyhow, she was a visiting scholar at like you're a visiting scholar, at Berkeley when I was auditing some classes, and her standard advice for how to write an opinion piece is to pay attention to what makes you laugh or what makes you angry. And that's the sort of thing you should be writing about. And so usually when somebody is really worked up about something or really amused by something, they have a good pitch. The bad pitches tend to be pitches that aren't paying attention to who they're pitching to. And so they'll pitch me something that, and often I'll say, oh, that would be a great story for Scientific American, or a great story for Nature, or for Grist or something, but it's just not what we do here. And so I had a round table with a bunch of other editors, about a dozen editors, a few years ago, and we published in a site called The Open Notebook. Does everybody read that? It's very practical advice.
Right. If you don't, I highly recommend that you check it out. It's full of very good first-person practical advice about science writing.
Yeah, and this was basically, it was sort of a support group for editors where we all talked about what we hate about pitches, like what are the mistakes that people make over and over again. And the big one was pitching a subject rather than a story, and pitching to a place that you don't understand who their audience is, what they try to do, and you just don't understand the outlet. And those are the main problems that we see over and over again.
So how do you want to be pitched? Do you want a phone call? Do you want an email? Do you want a Twitter? Well, they're going to ask you later, so we might as well get this out of the way now.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Twitter's fine,
don't call,
actually.
Don't call.
No, email's always the best, and my email's on my Slate page, and it's on my Twitter account. And sometimes, like just today, somebody tweeted at me, "How do I email you?" So I always just send back my email address. And I think, and that was something that was universal. All of the editors, and this was a few years ago, who were on this panel. And Robin Lloyd was one of them, from Scientific American. You should all know Robin.
Oh yes, hi Robin. You're behind the pillar, so I can't.
Robin, by the way, Robin, by the way, is another actual mentor. There are relatively few of them, but she's one of them.
I think that.
And a great editor too, from everything I hear.
Yeah.
So, but that was the main thing. So it was Robin. It was somebody from the New York Times. We had Wired. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to lean back. Now I can see you. Ah, there we go.
Yeah, Science, Nature. So yeah, we basically all just complained about that. And then my thing was pitch hygiene.
Pitch hygiene.
Hygiene, yes. please only pitch one story at a time with a subject line relative to that pitch. Because sometimes I'll get,
okay.
there are some people who pitch me different stories frequently, and the subject line will be from something we discussed a year ago, and so I usually go in and change it, but that's just minor things. So look it up. Everybody has their different peeves, but those things are the universal peeves of editors.
Dan, would you do me a favor and give the microphone to Robin, who, as long as she's here, I'd like to draft her to just simply ask her
Well, although
response
she's such a microphone hog, I don't
to
know
the
if I
same
really-
question, which is, what's the mistake that you see at,
I was writing notes on what I'd say about mentorship, but okay.
well, then I'd be interested.
Oh, that'd be good,
I'd be very interested in that too, but I thought I'd
Yeah.
snark you first with this, so.
A lot of them are
Speak into the microphone,
lengthy.
please.
Lengthy. A lot of them are lengthy.
yeah.
They don't get to the point, and because I also work in a fast turnaround environment with online. For the most part, I'm also working on the magazine lately. But even for a magazine pitch, at least for a news piece, 4 graphs is really all I'm looking for. And a lot of times there's not a headline, and they haven't really told me what the story's about. So I really need you to guide me there. Instead of telling me like what you're gonna do, you kind of have to do a mini version of where what the story is gonna be. Instead of sort of telling me your plan, you gotta kind of execute it to a certain extent. I also am, there's so many pitches we have to look at, and I have to say I'm a little mean. I'm a little iffy on similar topics. If there's a spelling error or
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
grammar error,
Oh, yeah.
syntax error. For a feature in the back of the book, that would be different. I'd be like, oh man, this is a great story. Who cares about the misspelling? But for like a news story, we have so little time to edit these pieces, and if I feel like you're going to get one past me, I kind of less likely to work with people. So it sounds kind of petty, but
So before, hold on. Like Laura, you are often on a very short turnaround cycle for a news piece. So how fast, if something's happening, and I think I know something clever, how fast do I have to get to you? What's my window of opportunity, typically?
couple hours after Laura's.
A couple of hours.
Yeah, a
Okay.
couple hours after Laura's. So,
Oh,
like
after Laura's, okay.
with the dress, we, for the first 4 hours, like, oh God, do we really have to write about this?
Right.
And at Scientific American, we can afford to be a little, we whatever. We're just kind of jerks that way. So, but then, around 5 o'clock, I was like, yeah, we really got to write about this. And we realized we had an expert on our blog network
Okay.
who knocked it out of the park. And I think that Macknick and Martinez's piece was on our site by 6. So we were lucky because we're very expert driven and networked with a lot of experts. It was pretty easy for us to figure out who to go to, and they were available. So
Right, and
we
you
got
have
lucky.
created this farm team,
Yeah.
which I know Scientific American does just out of the mentoring goodness of its heart, but it is a very convenient resource, the blog network. Mentoring. So as a practical matter, all right, I understand, okay, it's great, it's in your self-interest, you're a warm-hearted person, you don't like dogs
Yeah,
or children,
yeah.
so like why you'd like journalists is, I'm now completely clueless, who have so much in common with dogs and children. As a practical matter, what does being a mentor mean to you? I mean, how does that work? And I'd like you to think about the same thing, if you don't mind.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there are a few people who I've worked with, who've been in the office, who I've mentored in sort of a traditional, advice about your career moves type of way, or here's the sort of stories you should be writing. But because I work so much with freelancers, I haven't had that many opportunities to do that. So it's mostly mentoring freelancers. And in many cases, this emerges through a pitch session. They'll pitch me a story, and I'll realize it's a great story. I can't quite take it for whatever reason, but here's where you should send it. And I just give unsolicited advice, and that's sort of the beginning of a relationship. So
very generous.
nothing very. There's not much of a formula to it.
So you're not let's get together for coffee at 1:30 and I'll give you 20 minutes of, no? Okay.
No, I mean, when people call, and often, it seems like a lot of journalism programs, one of the assignments is call an editor or call somebody in the business and interview them about what they do, and so I always say yes to that. And basically, one way to get ahead, not just as an intern, but in your career in general, is to just say yes. If people want you to come talk, if they want to interview you, whatever it is, don't ever say no. You don't end up having a very good personal life that way, but it's career advice. It's a good way to go. So I basically just always say yes when somebody wants something from me, and sometimes good relationships
So
work
for
from
you,
that.
it kind of grows out of pitch conversations.
A lot of it, yeah.
And the conversation about, or the mentoring process then is a series of successful or not successful pitch conversations over time.
Yeah, and just people, whenever anybody asks me advice, I give it, even if they don't ask sometimes. So that's kind of what mentoring is, I guess.
Robin, how does it work for you? You're still taking notes.
No, she's actually got stealing stories from Laura right now.
No, I think like the most important thing that I do as a mentor, and this is going to sound kind of obnoxious, is be there. It's just to model like what an editor does, and to like, I'm aware that, at the higher end, at the higher paid and more power end of our field, there aren't a lot of women and people of color. So I just like representing a lot of the time and trying to be cool while I do it. In other words, stay calm under pressure. So I think that offers a lot, actually, and it feels like a lot of responsibility sometimes,
I just want to point something out, Dan, and then you can add whatever you want, which is that both Laura and Robin are being unnecessarily modest, and that one of the things that both of you do, which many don't, is that you were very active in your craft. You were very active in your profession. You have been on the board of the National Association of Science Writers. You've been on the board for a while, now you're vice president. You are active in organizing conference for other science writers. You have done so much in that regard, and that's a big piece of how you help other writers grow. And it's not simply a pitch call. You all are selling yourselves short.
Yeah, that's right. Oh, yeah.
So, Dan, please.
And I don't want to put people on the spot, but I think it would actually be interesting to hear from some of the people in the room who are 2, 3, 4, 5 years out that maybe are in the position where they wanted more mentorship than they were able to get, or they're in the position now where they're trying, even though they're young reporters themselves, to try to sort of figure out what mentoring means. I don't know who, Lily or Susan or Laura or Rachel, or Madeline, if anybody wants to talk about that. But I think it's a lot harder now that most of the time you feel like you don't really have someone that you can necessarily count on day in and day out, and so you're kind of figuring that out on your own and then turning around and trying to do things for other people too. So again, I don't want to force people to speak who don't want to speak, but anybody whose name I mentioned, or maybe other people who might want to speak to that are sort of figuring out where they are in the profession and realizing, how do you do this if you're not lucky enough to have somebody like Laura or Robin? How does that actually work?
I would think that one thing that has changed is that as the profession has become predominantly freelance, the issue of mentoring, on the one hand, is now something we actually talk about. Yeah. Because I know when I was coming up, I did not come up as a freelancer, and I had the benefit, I suspect, as you did, Dan, of the traditional newsroom, what I guess we would now call the reverse mentoring relationship, which is there would always be an editor who was hateful who bullied you.
No, that's true.
And you learned by doing the opposite of whatever that person was modeling.
But you also had positive mentors too.
Yeah.
You had both.
But you had a frame.
Yeah. Anybody want to try that?
Explicit.
Okay.
Yeah, good.
Lily Newman. We got some others
Yeah.
too.
And please tell us who you are.
Yeah. And what you do.
And what you do.
I'm Lily Newman. I'm a Sherp 31, and I work at Slate with Laura, so I'm lucky. But I was just going to say that when you were talking about internships before, one of the biggest support networks I feel like I have are people I met in internships who work at other places. And that was a really good way of building a foundation. And one lucky thing about working in journalism in the 21st century is you're allowed to G-chat at work. And so your network can always be with you, and you can always, and so not just peers your own age who are at roughly the same level in sort of your careers, but also if you had a good mentor and editor from another publication, or the person who you really love at the publication you're at, or if you're a freelancer and you've worked with lots of people. I mean, you're not bothering everyone all the time, but those people, if you give something to them, they'll give back to you, and you can always be available to each other. And I think that's a really nice aspect during the workday.
Yeah, that's more like peer-to-peer relationships, which are more important than ever.
And you don't know who's going to be your peer for long. I mean,
Yeah, I was going to say that for me, I'm Katie Hobson. I'm a freelance writer. I used to sit right next to Lee at the Wall Street Journal for a couple of years, and now I'm freelance. And I wasn't having many mentors as a staffer anyway in the last several years of working on staff, just because everything has gotten so quick that your editor doesn't really have time to be your mentor, at least not when you're at that publication. So I've done what you've done, is I've done a lot of peer-to-peer stuff. I have a group of people that I call my journalism crushes, who are people whose careers I really admire. And I've watched a lot of these interviews taped. I've listened to a lot of long-form podcasts, which are just an excellent source of kind of inspiration and roadmap for careers. And then I joined a small freelancing science writing networking group, and of people at different levels in their career, and we go back and forth on everything and have pitch slams and work on stuff together, and it's really, really helpful. But I find that much more from a peer level than kind of having one person who's 3 levels up from me that is kind of giving me advice every 2 months over coffee.
I'm Susan Matthews. I'm a Sherp 30, and I work at Audubon. To kind of take the opposite tack, for me, one of my great mentors, like Lily was saying, was an editor that I had at an internship, and it was Roxanne Kamsey. She works at Nature Medicine. She's a really intense editor, and I would get my stories back and be like, oh my God, I'm horrible, she hates me. And then it was like my last semester at Sherp, and so I just kind of was forced to, I made myself like send her my resume and cover letter, and I just said, like, I want you to critique these because I'm about to send them out to the real world. And she was incredibly helpful, and I've stayed in touch with her. And I think, like Robin was saying, it's not so much about like needing to, let's meet up every 2 months over coffee. It's like when I had a question about what I was doing or like what kind of move I was doing in my career, I would just bring it directly to her, and we would either get lunch or talk on the phone briefly or something. And that ended up being really helpful. So you can have a mentorship with somebody where you're not like every 3 months scheduling coffee. It just has to be somebody that you trust and who is tough, who will give you the direct truth and answer of like, go for this, or you're not quite there yet, or this is what you have to do to get there.
So it's getting value from your relationships, from your friendships, from your colleagues. And I didn't mentor Katie very much, or at all, but she mentored me in a lot of ways that she's probably not even aware of. She's the only reason I know how to use WordPress, for instance. But now I'm curious, so who mentored you? Or who mentors you? Who mentors you?
Oh, yeah, right now.
As you're stumbling forward, blindly
Yeah.
editing all the rest of us,
No, that's yeah.
who's teaching you
You'd
how to
like to
not
think-
make the, yeah, I'd like to
You'd
think
like
that
to think there's somebody who's showing me what to do.
I
No,
do,
not so
I
much.
do.
When I first started working at Science Magazine, Colin Norman ran the news department there, and fantastic editor, and also just the hardest working and the calmest person. And I think that's something that editors are very good at.
Calm.
Calm, yeah. So the writer gets to be dramatic. The writer is the creative genius, is the agonizing over how the story should go and what the story is and who to talk to, and with guidance. Hopefully, the editor is there at all points. But basically, the editor should just absorb and release the drama, and basically not make a bad situation worse and take a bad situation and make it better. And Colin was very good at that, just the calmest person you could ever imagine. So he was one of the editors I learned from in a positive way.
Besides being calm,
Yes, well, there were.
what did you learn?
So he was an excellent line editor, had a very good sense of story, and also he'd been around for a long time, and I think editors get so much better with time. Writers do too, but I think it's even more the case for editors, that the more time you're an editor, the more skills you learn, and just the more knowledge you accrue. And a lot of what you do as a really good editor is basically take a good story and say, okay, yeah, that's something, but let's bring in this angle and this angle, and you need to be aware of this line of research, and you're just basically accumulating knowledge all the time. And he knew everything. I mean, it was ridiculous.
Okay.
He'd been in the business for 20 years or so at that point. And there just wasn't a story that came by his desk in any field of science that he didn't know something about. So I think watching him, I learned to really respect having a wide base of knowledge, respecting your authors, being the calm, wise, non-dramatic, problem-solving type of person.
That doesn't come naturally to you?
Nah, well, I'm a little high-strung, so yes, it's an effort
You show
to
no
control
evidence
it.
of it.
Yeah, I've got a bad temper, but I've spent a lot of time keeping it under control.
Interesting.
It's a process.
Interesting. Mindfulness.
Yeah.
A lot of meditation.
No.
Yeah. Have to go calm down before you take that pitch call because.
No, I pick on my boyfriend.
Well, that's what they're for.
Yeah.
That's what they're for. So I'm curious now. We've been talking about sort of the calm and dispassionate and Olympian editorial perspective, but you're a ranter. You're a ranter and a raver and a table thumper and an ass kicker. And I'm curious, this is, historically, that's kind of like a church and state thing, like the editors, not editorial writers, but editors, they're quiet, they keep their opinions to themselves, they work in crowded rooms with lots of other like-minded, selfless people. But you in particular, but also it's kind of more the style, part of your gig is...
Before she answers.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
You're such a good host.
Yeah, isn't he? He's improving with time. He's improving with
Yeah,
time.
look at that.
Yeah. This is a
good.
new move, so, but I like it. So, as a role thing, first off, how does that work for you? Do you have certain topics that you've set aside that this is too enraging for me to edit something about? I'm going to write it about myself, or is it a time slate thing? I got to do this. I want to get it into the 10:30 attention span of all the people at work. I mean, what gives here?
So I very rarely write, and I usually only write when I'm just so worked up about something that I can't not write it. And sometimes, most of the time, for most of the stories I've written, I'll have an idea and I'll think, oh, somebody really ought to write this. And I'll talk to some writers and see if they're interested in the subject, and if I can't get anybody else to do it, then I'll do it myself. So I had one story that will basically prevent me from ever being hired by the National Institutes of Health, where I called them out. This is where I picked on Francis Collins,
Oh, well.
the director of NIH. Because basically the NIH was rewriting the history of when the human genome was sequenced, and they were celebrating the 10th anniversary and the 12th anniversary because they didn't want to recognize the 2001 anniversary when Celera came up with its own human genome sequence, as did NIH and the public consortium. So if you were around, was anybody covering science at that point or reading about it? Yes. So it was this great battle at the time. Like, it was just super juicy. They hated each other. They said terrible things about each other, sometimes in public, sometimes whispering in journalists' ears. So I was at Science Magazine at the time, and so I saw like some of the worst behavior of these two competing teams who, were basically trying to attempt this, most magnificent, wonderful accomplishment of the, culmination of the beginning of the 21st century, end of the 20th, to sequence the human genome. And there were two competing teams, and anyhow, one of the teams eventually dropped out for various financial reasons mostly, and personality reasons. And so NIH was the only team standing, and they basically pretended that whole thing didn't happen. And I noticed this when I was at Smithsonian. I couldn't say anything about it then, and then there were some other anniversary things, and I kept trying to get other writers to write about it. Everybody was like, yeah, that's really bad, they shouldn't do that. And so I found myself saying, no, it's really bad, they shouldn't do that. And so that's when I said that Molly Ivins said you should notice what makes you mad or what makes you laugh, and that's what you should write about. And my addendum to that is you should notice what makes you swear. And so whenever I find myself cursing about it, like, that goddamn NIH, can't believe they're doing this. And whenever that happens, then I realize, oh, I probably should write that down. So that's where most of my story ideas come from. And the same way, like the first story I wrote for Slate was about Jonathan Franzen. Mm-hmm. And he was in an HBO documentary it was a beautiful documentary about the birders of Central Park. There were all these just wonderful people and beautiful birds, and there was Jonathan Franzen being a jerk in the corner. And so I was talking to people about this and saying, yeah, Jonathan fucking Franzen. And so that's when I realized,
I think it is his middle name. I think.
Yeah. So that's where most of my stories come from, is just ire.
Ire.
Okay. How do you know that you've got a publishing-worthy rant? And what characterizes a successful rant? The students just finished opinion pieces. And they go sort of back and forth on the question of how much evidentiary support they need, and how much they should introduce, and how much should just be just pure entertainment. I'm pissed. Here's why I'm pissed.
Yeah, that's a good question. And if anybody wants to send their rants, if there's anything you think would be slate-worthy. So everybody has a rant in them, or multiple rants. And definitely, I mean, you can publish a rant in it. There are publications that will publish any old rant that repeats gossip, that exaggerates. Mm-hmm. For us and for most places, we do want to have links or evidence or data to support your rant. That's might be a very small proportion of it. I mean, what we're really interested is your interpretation of the data. But there is a bit of a danger, partly because if you're doing a science-based opinion piece, scientists are great gossips. I mean, journalists are too, but scientists are really good gossips. And so you hear all kinds of things that might not necessarily be true or might not be substantiated. And so you have to kind of pick and choose the details you use. And those have to be substantiated because you will get sued on a rant. So you have to be much more careful on rants than anything else. But if the more data you have lined out, the more emphatic you can be, the more just over the top you can be, and the more fun you can have with it. So it's sort of, there's a relationship between how good your evidence is and how great your argument can be. But it's a beautiful thing. It's the one time in journalism where you're supposed to show, not tell, and here you can show a little bit, but really we want you to tell. Tell us what to make of it. Tell us what it all means. And it's a fun, you can't make a living doing it exclusively. For most people can't, but it's a really fun sideline and a fun type of writing to exercise when there's something that really grabs you.
So, do you find that they? I'm sorry. Do you find that they do well analytically? I mean, is yeah? I mean, they. I know the answer. I know the answer to the question, but answer it anyway. Yes. Tell everybody else.
Oh, it's ridiculous. Yeah.
So what are the lessons from that for either for the rant section of journalism or for journalism as a whole in terms of how much voice is the right amount?
Yes. Yeah. It's really. I mean, it's unfortunate for journalism on the whole, and it's especially unfortunate for explanatory journalism, which unfortunately it's really hard to get people excited about an explanation of something if it's a straight explanatory thing, and which is very unfortunate because the world needs to be explained. People need to understand more things about the world. They should be reading explanatory journalism, but they don't, or they don't as much as they should. But if you have an opinion about something, it's ridiculous how much attention it can get, especially on Facebook. And of course, we all serve at the pleasure of Facebook. If something is popular on Facebook, it is popular in general. If it's not, it probably won't be. And the things that tend to do well on Facebook tend to have very strong points of view, either, hey, this is great, or oh, this is awful. Actually, either one of those is going to outdo anything that's very much more subtle than that. But it is, there's definitely a market, there's an audience for it. People really enjoy a sense of outrage, a sense of absurdity, a sense of awe, laughing at things, laughing with things. So anytime you can tweak people's emotions with your opinionated pieces, that story has a good chance of getting a big audience.
What's your advice for young people then who they definitely have strong opinions, but they tend to be less confident about expressing them? There are a lot of people here in the room that I happen to know are highly opinionated in really interesting ways, but they tend to not really be comfortable going that way.
Yeah, and that's that's sort of the most important editing and mentoring I do, is encouraging people that this opinion they have, this take, this weird obsession is something that other people will really want to read about, and that it's a brave thing to do, to not just write about this science study that's about a dinosaur, which is really important and fun, and you can have a great time writing it, and people will have a great time reading it. But it's a completely different thing to write about your own emotions, your own memories, something that you have a very strong opinion about. But people love it, and so a lot of what I do as an editor is try to draw people out and get them to say more and more emphatically and more clearly and more belligerently in some cases what it is they think.
I have to say that there is no shortage of belligerence rage or indignation or just pointless vituperation on the internet. It's all free, and nobody's going to pay anybody for it.
Yeah.
I think the sweet spot that you have identified, and you express very well, I think in the essays that you do, is that you are certainly animated by your passion. You're blowing on that little ember of rage to get it flaring up, but that you go into the evidentiary roots of what's making you so goddamn mad. So it's not just that James Watson, Nobel laureate that he is also a guy who has a propensity for behaving like a drunken fool.
Yeah.
He is also wrong about this, that, and the other thing, and this thing. And that, to me, I think is what separates a personal rant, which is a fine way to spend your time, and email it to anybody you want, and an opinion piece that somebody will pay for. Okay. I mean, I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And it's also, my most successful stories have come out of things that happened, 10 or 15 years earlier, or, decades earlier. So, yeah, the more, and that's something.
So there's kind of a crock pot effect. I mean, it sort of simmers for a while.
Yeah. Ferments.
We have a question over here.
It's me over here. So listen, I just want to follow on, a question just following on the conversation that you're just actually now having for Laura. And that is, to what extent do you find that you have to either struggle with writers who are, say, beat reporters and are very well respected for being, for giving so-called balanced and objective coverage of their beats, and trying to get those types of reporters to be as opinionated and edgy as you need to be in order to write for Slate? So do you find yourself having to try to coax beat reporters kind of to the limit, and get them to kind of go out of their comfort zone? Do you find that sometimes they're worried about what their editors are going to think if they have a great deal of credibility, say, covering some particular subject, and then they're being asked in writing for Slate, and they want to write for Slate because they want to express their opinion, to possibly be in hot water with their editors who feel that they can no longer have credibility as a balanced reporter? So I just wonder how limiting a factor that is for you.
Yeah, it's definitely an issue, especially people who are on staff elsewhere. Because they're on staff at Nature, they are representing it, even if they don't even mention it in their author bio. They can still be linked to it, even if they have some disclaimer or something. So yeah, it's tricky for staff writers, and even for freelancers too. If they're really experts and have been covering a certain field, they really have to be careful about burning bridges. And a lot of times people will come to me with a great opinion piece and we'll refine it and amplify it a bit. But I'm very respectful of people being worried about not getting future work, because that's more. Their career is more important than any outrage story they write for Slate. So yeah, it does. There have definitely been cases where either the writer or I have said, "Are we sure you really want to say this?" So, yeah, that does happen. And then, the best thing is if somebody leaves a publication they've been writing for and has all of this, backed up stories that they weren't able to say at the time, and they can finally express it. So which is a little bit what happened when I went from Smithsonian to Slate. I had a lot of opinions that I hadn't been able to express. So that's a wonderful thing. If you ever get laid off and are looking for some sort of relief, release for all the emotion that churns up, writing opinion pieces about things you weren't allowed to have opinions about before might be a good way to work through the process.
Just to follow up on Michael's point is, I actually think that this is less of a problem than most people assume that it is. That there's kind of a recognition now in journalism in 2015 that it's actually okay for people to have opinions, and under most circumstances. There are exceptions, for sure. But that transparency is what matters most. And that as long as you're clear on what's evidence-based and what isn't, what's opinion and what isn't, that it really is okay. Although, of course, when in doubt, always check with, if you have a staff job, never do anything like that without checking, with your reporting editor.
But if I may just footnote that, it's okay, providing you check with your editor if you're a staff person, to express yourself in a colorful and open way, but you must always know there's a cost to everything.
Yeah.
And that anecdote that is just so delicious may well mean that scientist never talks to you again for as long as you live. I certainly have got a collection of those. And you often think, well, that wasn't so harmless. I mean, he, she, it. I mean, they did that. There were a lot of people around. I mean, but you'd be surprised. So it's still worth doing, but you just need to have your eyes open. You're not just in your room typing this into the computer. You've got a megaphone, and people have thin skins.
And that happened once. Somebody had just a fantastic anecdote on a really weak story, and I said, you can't blow this anecdote here. It's too good. It needs to be on a better story. Save it. Both because it would cost something and because once you've told it, you've told it. But mostly because it would cost something.
Yeah, it's often worth it, but
Yeah.
it just is worth being self-aware. I wonder if we could just for a minute talk about the environment. And by the environment, I don't mean clean water and breathable air, but the broader working environment of our craft, our profession. And you alluded a couple of minutes ago to, well, if it works on Facebook and whatever, increasingly one gets the feeling that Facebook is becoming the environment in which places that appear to be freestanding publications like Slate or BuzzFeed or others that are, giving us all a lot of hope because they're getting involved in science and technical coverage. I mean, how does that work? I mean, Facebook is, of course, the tail that wags just about everything these days. You have like a lot of people who just are doing search optimization and nurturing that relationship. Tell us about that. How does that work?
Yeah, we do.
How does that affect what you do?
It doesn't so much affect what I do. I mean, we have Chartbeat, we have Omniture, we have all these metrics to know.
I'm sorry,
which
slow that down a little bit.
Oh yeah, sorry. So
Chartbeat.
Chartbeat is a service that will tell you at any given moment exactly how many people are reading a given story, and in most cases where they came from. Did they come from Facebook? Did they come from your homepage? And it has a list of tweets, and so you can see. And so if you tweet something clever, you can go look and see, how many people clicked on it based on my tweet. It gives you, it's sort of this very crazy-making, obsession-making thing that's just constant data about what stories are doing well. And then Omniture accumulates uniques and page views over the course of a day, and every single day. Chartbeat's minute by minute. Omniture is over the course of a day. So we do pay attention to what stories do well, but the main lesson I've learned from looking at data for almost 3 years now at Slate is that it's really, really hard to predict what's going to go well. I don't think anybody could have predicted that the blue dress would be such an obsession, or that runaway llamas, or a lot of the stories that go viral. You wouldn't necessarily look at them from the outside and say, oh yeah, that's super fascinating. Everybody's going to want to see that. So yeah, it's hard to tell, and so there are certain things you can do to make a story more attractive to Facebook, but it's a really bad way to kind of make your reporting or editorial judgment guided by Facebook or Twitter. There's no percentage in trying to game that system, at least for us. I mean, I think BuzzFeed's done it, Gawker's done it, but I don't think anybody else can do it very well.
But they clearly have become a more inviting partner
Yes. Yeah. So Facebook, they have been tweaking their algorithm to make it, to basically give preference to stories that people click on, that people comment on, that people spend a lot of time on. So it's been very good for stories from Slate and from a lot of other publications that are legitimate journalism. Unfortunately, it's also been good for things like Natural News and some of the alternative health sites that are pushing homeopathy and all kinds of crazy badness. So they're constantly tweaking their algorithms to improve the Facebook reader experience, but that also improves the experience for journalists who are publishing, because Facebook has been very friendly to us in a lot of ways. Unfortunately, because people are getting their news from Facebook, they're not getting it from people's home pages.
Right.
So like the homepage views of BuzzFeed relative to any given story are quite low, the ratio is. On Slate, we still have a lot of people who come in through the homepage, which is great. Partly because we're at this point a legacy online magazine, because we've been around. We were one of the first, if not the first, online magazine. And the New York Times, of course, a lot of news sites have people who just go there and see what's new. But increasingly, all the traffic comes from people sharing. And so that means that kind of takes power away from the editors and the homepage editors who decide which stories to display, and gives power to the masses and what stories are getting shared by Facebook and Twitter.
So maybe we could conclude by one kind of last but open-ended question. In your lofty, open-hearted, warm, calm, nurturing perch there, I wonder, as you look kind of forward, a little bit over the horizon, I wonder what the trends, the publishing trends, the future that's taking place that's coming together under our nose. What are the things that you think we ought to be keeping an eye on?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, it's globally, I think the signal to noise ratio of things you can read online, the signal is always competing with more and more and more noise. It does seem like the signal's getting better, though, that it's a great time, of course, to be a reader of journalism. It's also getting to be a really great time to be a producer of journalism because of all the new bells and whistles and all the multimedia and video and all the the standard things you know about already. Nobody's figured out the business of it, and nobody seems to be close to figuring out the business of it. But it's still, people are still making a living, and I think they will continue to. And I think there's still a big audience of people who are ever more engaged and intelligent and educated, who want to read good things online, or good things in print in some cases too. So I think the audience for quality journalism is growing. So I think that's a cause for optimism.
So I'd be right then in thinking you don't regret not having stuck with the pre-med thing.
No, I'm having a blast. This is a great, there's for the most part, people love their jobs. People complain about them, but for the most part, people in some cases like being at work more than they like being at home. And people tend to, end up doing things that they enjoy in many ways. But it's hard to beat journalism. This is just a blast of a career. It's a wonderful, wonderful way to spend your life.
Well, I think it must be if we were all writing for you. So thank you for spending this evening with us, and thank you for sharing your enthusiasm and your expertise. I'm going to walk out of here now feeling a little bit better about what I do. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.